Good evening, everybody. I'm Rabia Akhtar, Director, Center for Security Strategy and Policy Research, University of Lahore. I'm here with a very special guest, Daniel S. Markey. He's a Senior Research Professor in International Relations. He's also Academic Director of the Masters of Arts in Global Policy Program at Johns Hopkins. For a Pakistani audience, he does not need any introduction. His book No Exit from Pakistan was and still is a bestseller, and we're hoping that his latest book, China's Western Horizon, Beijing, and the New Geopolitics of South Asia, also becomes a bestseller. So welcome to our session, Dan. We will begin by asking you to please share some of the takeaways from your recent book, China's Western Horizon, and give us some key takeaways for Pakistani audience. And then I will move to Ali, who's reviewed your book for Pakistan Politico, to share some of.
Absolutely.
Over to you. Can you hear me?
Hello?
Yeah, over to you, Dan.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, the technology is not perfect, so I lost you a bit at the end, but you had asked for some key takeaways from the book, and so I can easily do that. First of all, let me thank you for holding this. It's great to see you and to see Ali and to be connecting even virtually with Pakistan. I think at the core, I'll make 3 points. The first would be that in a way, this book was motivated by, inspired by an observation from South Asia and from Pakistan in particular. And that observation really was born many years ago for me now, maybe a decade or more ago, by recognizing that while many things in South Asia are evolving gradually, and many things, unfortunately, or for better or for worse, tend to stay the same, such as hostility between India and Pakistan. Some new things are happening, and one of the most interesting and important new things is the rise of China and its increasing involvement in South Asia. And I tried to think about this at some length in my last book, but it's probably the most, I thought, most interesting story of the region because it is new and it has a global consequence. And so that's why I wanted to write this book. And at the core of it was the recognition that China is not only sort of expanding its trade and economic ties with South Asia as it does everywhere else, but that this would have very direct, sometimes unintended consequences for the neighborhood. And so that was the starting point. And the book itself starts with this story of the port of Gwadar, because I think that it's so revealing of two other aspects of what I've come to learn, not just in South Asia, but also as the book expands its view to Central Asia and even into the Middle East. And the first of these two observations is that China's involvement, though it often, almost always, starts with an economic component, whether that's just increasing trade and then followed by investment and in terms of equity stakes in local companies, and then can include even more joint ventures and major joint projects like the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, but now with the Belton Road Initiative, with similar types of ventures in countries like Kazakhstan or Iran, which I will also look into the book. It starts economically, but very quickly it will have a political consequence. And this is not special to Chinese investment. This is true of any investment. And the basic observation is that the economics translates into politics. and can translate into politics in a variety of different ways. But generally, it's a question of who wins from Chinese involvement, who wins more, who wins less, and who might actually lose from all of this. And as we know from politics in any country, this kind of question of division of the spoils or relative gains within a society is something that all politicians know at their core. They understand the significance of this because it's not just a matter of whether the nation grows, but which parts of the nation grow. And so we see that in Pakistan. We see groups having believed that they got more or less, and this inspiring a kind of contentious politics within the society. So that's the first takeaway. And that is not special to Pakistan, although it is on display in Pakistan. I also see that in the other cases that I look at more closely in this book. So in Kazakhstan, we certainly see this with certain individuals and groups within the society poised to really take advantage of Chinese investment. In Kazakhstan, it's in the energy sector, or in Iran with a similar kind of thing, with some businesses succeeding, some being actually harmed outright by greater Chinese involvement in the Iranian market because they simply can't compete. And that frames how they perceive China's involvement very differently. And so there are unintended consequences that would be, so that's second point, unintended domestic, political, economic consequences from Chinese involvement. The third point is that there are also likely to be intended or unintended geopolitical, at the regional level, strategic consequences from China's greater involvement. So taking this back to South Asia, obviously the India-Pakistan hostility and conflict is something that hasn't gone away and is being affected, whether China intends this or not, by China's greater involvement in Pakistan, China's greater support for Pakistan. And of late, of course, that plays into a context in which India-China hostility has also risen considerably. And all of these things are interconnected. Now, I think, let me just step back and conclude by saying some of this is going to be obvious to Pakistani audiences and Pakistani readers. They would say, of course, but much of this book is intended for certainly American readers and other international readers who typically, when they look at the rise of China, really are only concerned with asking the question of what China wants and what is China trying to do in the world, and how, certainly in Washington, how should the United States respond? And my concern, as in writing this book, has been that so little attention has been given to the very important domestic and regional reactions to China, expectations for China, perceptions of China, and the interests of these states themselves that I think actually are as likely to frame, inform, and even define what China is doing in their neighborhoods, as much or more than what China wanted in the first place. And so analytically, the takeaway is we in the United States, but elsewhere as well, need to recognize the agency of local players. And again, this is not a huge surprise, but this has been lost in too much of the framing of this debate in the United States. And so I wanted to shift that back. And then with that additional framing, that, and I can get to this later if you want to talk about it, but that would frame also America's reaction to China in these places, because just seeing this as a US-China competition ignores at least half the story. And
Are you there with me, Dan? Okay.
Yes, sorry, I lost you for a minute.
Yeah, just connectivity issue. All right, so all of this is really fascinating. And sometimes, what is most obvious is,
Ah,
I'm sorry, I'm back again.
okay, I see Ali. So when we get to him, he seems to have good connectivity, so I'll be able to go back and forth with him. But I lost you. You said sometimes the most important thing, I
Yeah,
think, and
sometimes the
you
most
cut out.
obvious thing is the one that we miss out on. So, my just one question that I have for you before I move to Ali. Um, so you said that there are unintended domestic political consequences for the economic engagement that China makes. Um, do you have any sense whether China is aware of this, and when they are planning, is there any sense of these unintended consequences that are taken into account when they're going so massive in these regions? For example, CPEC and as to how it would pan out, and also there are other engagements with other South Asian countries and beyond South Asia. So just a word on that, if you could.
Absolutely. I think that China broadly is, and this is generalizing a lot, increasingly aware of these realities. And it's been on a learning curve, not just with the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, but with the Belton Road Initiative writ large. And so let me give you a little bit more color here. Um, I think that when China launched the Belt and Road Initiative, it was driven by domestic political and economic imperatives and a broad global framing of a new and greater ambition on the part, in particular, of President Xi Jinping, but of China more generally. And I think that that was the principal driver for the expansion of China's agenda, particularly westward. Security concerns also had something to do with it, and in particular, concerns about the security troubles that China was facing in Western China, in Xinjiang in particular, and the sense that these security concerns were connected to countries further to the west, including Pakistan, also Afghanistan and Central Asia, and a desire to address all of these things. There was a broad political imperative to do these, to take on these new initiatives, and to do so in a developmental fashion, which was intended to be framed as non-threatening and economic growth oriented. But I think a lot of the devil is always in the details. And I think that Chinese officials felt that those details would get sorted out over time. And Chinese experts on South Asia, of which there are some, but not a huge number, were well aware of a number of these complicating factors from the start. But I don't think that they were in the driver's seat for the policy. Now, over time, I think they have gradually started to, I've been told specifically by some of them that they have learned a lot and they are continuing to learn, and that, be patient is the message. Give us time to adjust to this. And I think there's a broader point here, which a number of American scholars have noticed, is that China is making considerable new investments in its own capacity to understand the rest of the world. And this is part of the process of becoming a great power. And China's investments, I think, will gradually pay off in its ability to work more effectively in other countries, and to anticipate the politics, the political implications of its involvement as they go. So this is a work in progress. This is a kind of a less well-told part of the rise of China story and the rise of China's ambition story that I think we should pay close attention to, because the better that China learns these lessons, one can say the more effective China is likely to be. And that will be, from an American perspective, good and bad, because there's some debate the United States about whether China's success in these initiatives is good for the United States, or whether we would in fact prefer that it stumble. And we can get into that if you like, but I think, at the core, the answer is China's learning.
All right, that's great. I hope the American audience, also takes the right takeaways from your book, and gets to see that China is on a learning curve. So I will now move to Ali, and Ali is going to share his thoughts about your book, and will pose a question or two, and then I'll also ask you some questions. So over to you, Ali.
Thank you very much. Congratulations, and thank you, Daniel, for writing an exceptional book on a very important subject, which I finally managed to read after so many attempts at getting the book. I think there are a number of reasons why the book is important and must be read. I think at the very outset, the fact that you have mentioned the pushes and pulls that the Eurasian region have for China, I think that's important, because we're talking about Cold War 2.0, we're talking about the Sino-US rivalry, but unfortunately the US, as you also alluded to, is looking at China through a single prism. But you have done one thing which is important for US policymakers, is that you have not only highlighted how China influences its neighbors, but also highlighted how those neighbors influence China. I think this is important, and this was a missing link that the US policy, be it the Indo-Pacific strategy or in anywhere else, is certainly missing. And understanding what you have written would definitely help a more nuanced policy being made inside DC. I think that's very important. That you mentioned Pakistan at the very beginning. In fact, you start your book with the story of Gawada. I think that's very emblematic of a lot of things. Number one, China really regards South Asia as a very important region, and within that, Pakistan is obviously the linchpin because of CPEC. You have identified correctly, to a point, the impediments that China faces in Pakistan, be it political, economic, and others. But the fact that China is willing to remain focused and willing to navigate those challenges, I think it's quite telling. And the recent upsurge in CPEC is also instructive in that regard, that both countries are willing to seen many a report on all these issues. I have a problem with one thing in your chapter on South Asia. I think maybe you could give a different perspective on that, and maybe you could help us understand better. You have analyzed China as a stabilizer and as a potential debating factor between India and Pakistan. For me, the more economic interest China has in the region, the less likely it would be to play a subversive role, directly or indirectly. So I think if Pakistan, and it certainly is jumping on the connectivity bandwagon, it would not use Chinese efforts at bolstering it to the detriment of regional stability and peace. I think this is something that we need to understand, and a bit of perspective has to be brought in that regard. I would again go back to how this book is more important for US policymakers. I think your chapter on the Middle East is very important. There are a number of reasons as to why I say this, but the most important reason is that we know that Iran and the US are inveterate enemies, and they have no love lost for each other, and they don't intend to be friends anytime soon. And Iran is obviously wooing China, as you very rightly and brilliantly explained throughout that chapter. Obviously, that is a concern for the US as well, because the US then cannot, go to full throttle with Iran, because if it goes, then we will have a you miss, I hit scenario. But the problem that the US policymakers should focus on is as to why the Saudis are trying to woo China. Because if one of your friends is trying to kowtow one of your principal enemies, then we have a problem that needs to be sorted out. And I think all in all, this book, I wrote in the review that this is a watered down version and a non-militaristic version of NSC 68 written by Paul Nitze, who I think this is, I'm saying this because a careful and even a cursory look and reading of your book would help US makers understand that there are a variety of ways by which the US can, counter China speak. And for instance, CPEC, you also argued in one of your recent pieces for the Carnegie Institute that the US needs to recalibrate its thinking regarding CPEC. And I think the book has amplified that in more ways than one. But I think that whatever becomes of China's Western horizon, I think it is likely to open up multitude of opportunities, but obviously challenges would be concomitant, because there are elements that do not want to let some states, jump on that opportunity bonanza. I think I'll stop here and then we can discuss later.
Thank you so much, Ali. Over to you, Dan. You can give your comments on some of the questions he's raised. Dan, you're muted. Sorry.
So sorry. Ali, thank you for the close reading of my book and for your characterization of it, which is quite right in so many ways. And so I appreciate that. Anybody who has written a book always appreciates anybody who will actually read their book. So for that, I am quite indebted. Let me try to respond to at least a few of your points, because you make some great ones. The first, I think, most important point that you make is that China is willing to work through and with Pakistan to overcome some of the domestic challenges to the success of the China-Pakistan economic corridor that I do identify in the book. And there I grant you, as I will in a couple of other cases, that this seems to be happening at one level, and that it is possible, and in many ways is the best possible outcome. If we step back just simply and look at the challenge that Pakistan faces from an American perspective, at the core of that challenge has been a developmental crisis, right? A need for Pakistan to grow economically rapidly to meet the needs of its people, is growing population, rapidly growing population, in a way that would address social discontent, political discontent, and lead to both prosperity and peace at home and in its region. That's something the United States has said it wanted for years, and I have believed that. That is US developmental assistance to Pakistan has had some but limited consequence. And so if China can do better, in many ways, that's something to be cheered. The challenge is that parts of what China is doing and appears to have done are quite helpful. So areas in terms of power generation is the most obvious. Other parts are, as you know well, continue to be somewhat contentious. And so, for instance, something that China, I'll pick one that China hasn't done, but which could do, had to do with this question of agriculture and land reform and getting involved in Pakistan's agricultural sector. Now, again, this is something that we haven't seen come to full fruition yet, but it is studded with thousands of political complications because this is such a sensitive topic in terms of land ownership, even land long-term leasing is a sensitive issue. And yet for Pakistan to succeed broadly, it does need to come to terms with, to increase agricultural productivity, to, in many ways, consolidate smaller holdings, to mechanize and modernize its processes. These are all necessary things. But the more that China becomes involved in that, the more contentious it will be. And I think most Pakistanis are well aware of the pitfalls that are there. So the more that China gets involved, the more it is stepping into difficult, fraught territory. And I would say that in each one of these instances, China has learned some, but part of what it's learned is it doesn't like the politics. It doesn't like to be caught in that mess. And so it's backed off from some of these areas. But then when it backs off, it's less likely to actually help Pakistan reform in precisely the areas where it needs the greatest reform. One other example would be, and I mentioned this in the book, in order for Chinese investments in infrastructure and power generation to have the greatest benefit to Pakistan, they should be leading other outside investors to throw money into the Pakistani market and to build Pakistan's industry so that it is stronger. What that means is that China should be one of many outside investors, and that the reforms associated with China's investment should be creating more opportunities, more opening of Pakistan's markets rather than closing. And so far, we haven't seen that. Now, there are some unfortunate additional events have taken place, right? This isn't just a story of CPEC's not the only thing that's happening in the world. Far from it. And COVID right now may be the more defining reality for Pakistan's economy and for the global economy, and Pakistan's being swept up in that. So I don't want to overjudge the situation, but what Pakistan needs is not just Chinese investment or involvement. It needs maybe Chinese leadership on this that then would sweep in other outside investors to really bring along the growth and opportunity that Pakistan needs. So, so I would have hoped to see legal and regulatory reforms that would be encouraging for not just Chinese, but also American, European, East Asian investors to really make Pakistan friendly to outside involvement. And I'd still like to see that and to make it safe for outside involvement. And just the quick story that I always tell is, Pakistan was willing to raise a security force for Chinese workers. Where was the security force for the American workers or for the French workers or for the Japanese workers? All of them would love to have that kind of backing from the Pakistani state in order to guarantee their security while in the country. So this is, anyway, you get the point. So that's answer one. Your second point about whether China might be a more stabilizing force in South Asia, also, you're right, is something I look at, and I'd love to see that be the case. And there have been some instances where we could be hopeful. Because as you point out, the more China invests in Pakistan, and frankly, the more it invests in India, the more that Beijing has an incentive to protect its investments in both countries. And so I think that's one line of reasoning that we've seen so far that may actually have contributed to some risk-averse behavior by Beijing over the past 5 years. But there's another counter line of reasoning, which I think has actually been the more powerful so far, which may not be necessarily what China has intended by backing Pakistan, but it is undoubtedly the case that it has immediately raised Indian suspicions through the roof, at the same time as India is under a much more nationalistic, Hindu chauvinist, you would say, definitely more likely to push back militarily to real and perceived threats, either by Pakistan or China. So the mix of a much more kind of ambitious and aggressive India, seeing China increasingly involved in Pakistan, and perceiving also simultaneously the rise of China at its doorstep in its entire neighborhood, has, I think, played into a sense of threat on India's side that compounds its already more militarized response to China and to Pakistan in the region. That leaves aside whether or not you buy my argument that a Pakistan which is backed by China feels perhaps emboldened in its dealings with India. You can judge that. But I would say that even if you just focus on India's reaction, intended or unintended, you get a destabilization in the region. Precisely where you want to place the blame, that's up to you. But what I'm seeing in the region is heading more toward less stability, not more stability, for a variety of reasons. And China's behavior, whether it likes it or not, is playing into that. And so that's the problem that I face. Now, on the Middle East, great question there. I mean, you're right. Shouldn't the United States be more worried about Saudi Arabia courtship of China than just Iran's? And the answer is yes, the United States is and should be worried about that. But this is partly, my own view is partly a reflection of the simple reality that China is a powerful and attractive partner. And if you are Saudi Arabia and you have basically one thing to sell, which is energy, and one plus a few other important partners. I mean, Japan's still important, Europe's still important, but the United States is not an important buyer of Saudi oil anymore, and China is. The United States needs to be realistic about its partners, including partners like Saudi Arabia, and recognize that it cannot simply assume that they will be 100% there with the United States no matter what. Now, I have other problems with Saudi Arabia and its policies and politics, both at home and abroad, which lead me to raise questions about the nature of the US-Saudi relationship. But my point in this book is simply the United States shouldn't be trying to get Saudi Arabia to somehow move away from China or not imagine that China will be increasingly important to Saudi Arabia's economic and strategic picture. That's just a reality that we're living in. And that takes me to your last question. You likened this project to NSC 68, Paul Nitze. I think maybe in a way it's more akin to a George Kennan version of containment, which is to say that the United States needs to recognize where it has strengths and where it has weaknesses. The limitations of American power, particularly in the current environment, are very real. And we need to focus our attentions on things that are realistic, things that we can actually do. That's why I and many others are so upset about us, the United States, pulling away from our traditional allies in Europe and in Asia at a time when we cannot afford to have distance between us and partners like the Germans or the UK or the Japanese or the Koreans or the Australians or anyone else. These are essential partners. And those are our strengths. And these are our principal trading relationships. And we move away from them at our peril. And we overestimate our ability to influence the world also at our peril. And so we need to be realistic about this. That's where the book is really coming from. So again, thank you for the questions and for reading the close reading of my book. It's fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan. Great questions, Ali, and great responses, Dan. So while we are still talking about Middle East, let me pose a quick question to you about the China-Iran deal. We haven't seen the official, version of it yet, but what do you think about that deal? And in the light of your research, how do you think this will affect China's relationship with the US with respect to Iran in particular, and also Indo-Iranian relations and Pak-Iranian relations, if this deal was to go through and China was to make this very heavy commitment in Iran?
Great question, and something that I'm fascinated by, because this is another example of really new developments. Now, as I point out in the book, China's relations with Iran go back decades. So in that respect, just like with Pakistan, it's not new. But we're talking about potentially a quantum leap forward in terms of that relationship in ways that we have never seen before, and really never historically seen. So this isn't a rekindling of something old. This is just something very new under the sun. And so that makes it fascinating. And certainly from an analytical perspective, makes it exciting to be witness to. Now, the first thing I would point out is right now, we should be very careful not to overstate what's happened. All informed observers are quick to point out that this is almost not even an agreement on paper, because, as you say, it hasn't even been brought to light officially. So, so we should first recognize that, and that would be reason enough to avoid any overestimation of how important this is. The second point would be there is a very good reason to read almost all of what is happening as a direct response to US policy. The United States, under President Trump, moved away from the international deal, nuclear deal with Iran. And in doing so, by walking away from that deal, put Iran in a very difficult position. Now, here in the United States, we have all kinds of disagreements over the wisdom of that. But the practical reality for Iran was that it learned pretty quickly, no longer, certainly couldn't turn to the United States, but beyond that, couldn't really trust the Europeans either, and was left with basically two options, or two remaining options: Russia, which is already very much in bed with on the military front, but has no capacity to bail out Iran's economy and no particular interest in doing so; and China, which has enormous capacity to assist Iran in just about every aspect, or to assist Iran's regime in every respect. And so it was only natural that Iran would quickly pivot, as it has been said, look eastward and look to China. What has been surprising over the past 3 years is how long it took China to pick it up and to run with it. And that is, again, a reflection of China's risk aversion, and in particular, its concern that it didn't want to find itself in another fight with the United States, particularly as it was engaged in touchy, sensitive trade negotiations with the Trump administration for almost the entire period of this first term in office. And so China's risk aversion also should be recognized. But under the radar, it is clear to me that China and Iran have been working together, and there have been a number of ways that China has continued to help keep the Iranian regime afloat, partially by continuing to buy oil under the radar, illicit, basically purchases of oil, circumventing US pressure and sanctions, as well as political, military, and technological assistance directly to the Iranian regime to assist its efforts to maintain itself in power, including to repress opponents within Iran, to keep the opposition down, using the Iranian internet, surveillance, and other technologies supplied by China. So all of this is happening, and China is very much in bed with Iran. About the American reaction. if China is less worried about America's response, in other words, if China believes that America is implacably hostile to China no matter what it does, then it may choose to go ahead with a much closer relationship with Iran, even though it would upset the United States. That takes me to the region. Saudi Arabia obviously would prefer that China not have a closer relationship with Iran. So Saudi Arabia will seek and has sought in the past to try to mitigate that closeness, to try to buy China off, to try to promise Beijing increasing sales of oil and to make up for whatever shortfalls it would face from Iran, and will continue to do so. But Saudi Arabia doesn't have the ability to block China. Saudi Arabia, as I said before, is itself dependent on sales to China, so it doesn't have total leverage. Certainly can't threaten China, can only make inducements or promises. And then finally, you asked about the implications for South Asia. And here too, there are some important questions. Some are suggesting, and I'd be curious what you think, that China is, by pursuing a closer relations with Pakistan and Iran, will be increasingly in a position to try to smooth relations between Pakistan and Iran, which have historically had some tensions, and will create a kind of a corridor across South Asia and into the Middle East, leading right up to the Persian Gulf, overland corridor that will be quite useful to China strategically and economically going forward, and would bring together the interests of a number of states who might over time become increasingly seen as part of a pro-Chinese bloc, and perhaps even an anti-American bloc. And so that's one way that you could project out. But let me just take you back, because I don't want to leave with the wrong impression. At the moment, none of this is real. At the moment, we have to see that this is barely a paper agreement and not get ahead of ourselves. But these are the kinds of things that we, I think, need to think about as potential implications over time.
Exactly. You know, sometimes I do think, you know, this talk of China, Iran, you know, thinking about working on this parallel corridor is not new, has happened before and, you know, in previous years as well, but did not materialize. And sometimes I think that probably China wants to have these parallel corridors because what if, you know, Pakistan is unable to deliver and Pakistan gets bogged down with the domestic politics of it all and does not meet the timeline. So at least it has an option of a parallel route going through Iran. But this US-Iran thing is also really interesting. And just as of yesterday, we heard Zalmay Khalilzad saying that US has invited Iran to become part of the Afghan peace process. So that was, you know, really interesting. I don't know how this came about and whether there's a change of heart. Is it for the elections, or how are things going to pan out between US and Iran if Iran is invited to become part of the Afghan peace talks? Do you, I know it's a bit off topic, but do you have any comment on it?
You know, I think American policymakers working on Afghanistan have always wanted to kind of stovepipe the Iranian relationship with respect to Afghanistan from everything else in our relationship with Iran, because at least in two ways, we basically agreed with Iran. One is in terms of concerns about the Taliban, and the other is concerns about narcotics. And both the United States and Iran have been worried about Afghanistan, the narco state, and about the resurgence of Islamist Taliban who would be opposed both to the United States and historically has been opposed to Iran. And so from the Bonn Agreement and negotiations to the present day, there have been American diplomats and policymakers who have really seen, first of all, they know Iran is important to stability in Afghanistan because it's a neighbor and because of its tremendous influence in Western Afghanistan and even in Kabul. So they know that Iran is necessary, kind of like Pakistan is necessary And so they don't want to pick fights that would unravel our efforts in Afghanistan. So they know all of these things. They've wanted to get Iran to the table and involved in the process. And at various points, Iran has been helpful, or at least not harmful. But they also recognize, or have to recognize, that the broader global kind of context of our relationship with Iran is so poisoned that it's really difficult. And at times it's just been simply impossible to separate out these different features, and to think that Iran wouldn't use its leverage in Afghanistan to harm US interests in a way that it's used its leverage in Iraq to harm US interests, and elsewhere in the Middle East to harm US interests, often seems absurd. And the basic premise I'm sure that Zal has is, why would Iran in Afghanistan hurt itself just to hurt the United States? Maybe we can just rest on a kind of a narrow convergence of interests here to advance the process in Afghanistan, despite everything else in the world that's going on. That's his hope. I don't know how realistic it is, but I will say one thing about Zalmay Khalilzad is he is a man of almost infinite optimism and ambition. And sometimes you need that for a diplomat to be successful.
Absolutely. And when it's Pakistan, Iran, or China, you need to have optimism about you. Also Afghanistan, throw that in. Ali wrote about this topic. So Ali, would you briefly want to say something before I move to the next question with
Yes, thank you. So I recently wrote this piece that if this China-Iran deal were to materialize, it could have, it could provide impetus to China to play a leading role in enabling Iran and Pakistan to mend fences. I gave a couple of points in the economic interests on both sides of the border will help China play a significant role in pushing both countries to sort out their border issues, which they're already sorting out. The other thing is that then Pakistan and Iran are already trying to mend their fences ever since this government came to power. So I think that China will help in that regard as well. And the other thing is that one of the biggest irritants in Pak-Iran relations has been Iran's closeness with India, and China, by virtue of investing more inside Iran, would reduce India's ability to maneuver and, to an extent, use the Chahbar port against Pakistan. And let's be very clear that Iran and Pakistan both have repeatedly talked about linking Chahbar and Gwadar together. So China would help. You also said nothing is on paper, so we don't know if this deal will materialize or not. So I think this was my broad framework, but the framework depends on if and when the deal materializes or not. Thank you.
Great points. And my only reaction to that would be, first of all, to say that in terms of a timeline for recognizing whether this is actually happening, I think that everything is on hold for the American elections. And so, that's only a matter of 5 weeks away. And then we should have a much better sense as to whether this will move forward in the way that it seems to be in terms of rumors and leaked documents and things like that, or whether both China and Iran will be looking to see what a new Biden administration would actually be bringing to the table and reassessing their opportunities and risks accordingly. Now, your argument is great, and Ali, and I would only make one other observation, which is that for every move that may, say, for instance, bring Pakistan and Iran closer together, reduce tensions, which generally, objectively, is a good thing. For every step forward, do we take one or two steps back in terms of firming up India's sense of encirclement and firming up a kind of a two-block South Asia, even broader region, in which you're either with us or against us. When we have these complicated and overlapping relationships in which Pakistan sees some huge benefits to working with both China and the United States, or Iran feels that it has a need to work with both India and China. These things are complicated and come with all kinds of potential risks, but the cross-cutting relationships can also alleviate or reduce some of the frictions and tensions, because each state is looking at multiple overlapping pressures and needs to play a balancing game and navigate skillfully between them without siding too firmly one way or another. And so, so I think we should think about, this is more of just a call for more work. Think about the risks of a simplified map, geopolitical map of the region, one in which it's quite obvious who's on China's side and who's on America's side, and what that will mean for each one of the regional players. I, for one, believe that most of the world would actually prefer to play a somewhat more hedged game, in part because they have so much to gain and lose if they only side with one economically. The Chinese bring so much to the table, but so does the United States and the rest of American partners in Europe and so on. So nobody wants to just be with the Chinese and be vulnerable to Chinese pressure, but neither does anyone want to give up the opportunities that come from close work with the Chinese and economic opportunities and otherwise by just siding with the Americans. And so that balancing act is something that is very uncomfortable for us. Ali used the word Cold War 2.0. The world seemed to be simpler during the Cold War, but a true Cold War, first of all, is a ways off because of even though we're clear competition with China, but secondly would potentially risk even more because the restraints on aggression, on conflict would be reduced. So we all wonder about, is that actually where we want to go? And to some extent, we'll have control over that, and to some extent, it will unfold in spite of our intentions. So we just have to be watching it.
Well articulated, Dan, but I think it would be detrimental for Pakistan if anybody got this impression that, a bloc is being formed. I think Pakistan, it's in best interest of Pakistan to, through its actions, to relay that, none of its relationships are a zero-sum game, especially the one with China is also not a zero-sum game, and Pakistan surely does not want the US to look at Pakistan that way. I say that Pakistan suffered a lot when Pakistan was looked at through the AFPAC prism, and Pakistan tried to dehyphenate itself. And if Pakistan was now looked at through the China prism, then again, it tends to lose a lot. So I'm sure consciously Pakistan would want, this bloc not to appear in people's minds or consciousness or drive their policies, with respect to Pakistan. I'll just pose two last questions. One is that you must have read Andrew Small's report on CPEC, and I don't know if you agree with Small's assessment about Beijing's disappointment. What is your thoughts on the CPEC authority and the recent upsurge in CPEC projects that have taken place? And do you analyze the trajectory of this project in broader ties between, how do you look at that trajectory going forward from here onwards after a period of lull?
Great. Yes, I have read Andrew's report, and I think it's an excellent next sort of updating of his book. In a sense, what he's trying to do is push the history forward that he covered in his fantastic book. I've had a number of conversations with Andrew. Certainly, he's a friend and a colleague who I see regularly these days, only by Zoom, but still. And we've had kind of a friendly back and forth over how to interpret kind of the evolution of Cpec. Because I think that he, partly because he was following it very closely, more closely than I have to admit, he saw this upsurge and then a peak in terms of investment and promises and plans. And then he saw a kind of a down, almost falling off the cliff. And so his interpretation was that, and you can read this in his piece, that you were returning back to the future, in a sense, going back to a much more narrowed set of relations and a narrowed ambition for China in Pakistan. I was willing to accept the characterization that, first of all, the initial characterization of Cpec was inflated. The numbers were inflated. There was a lot of kind of overdone enthusiasm. And yet you still saw, something on the order of $20 billion and a considerable injection of Chinese investment that wasn't coming from anywhere else. So its political consequence and strategic consequence probably matched, if they didn't outdo, the economic consequence. They were very, very important timing and in terms of the politics. What I see in terms of coming back down is, yes, coming back down, but still at there's a new normal. There is a new floor created, it seems, in the relationship. So it doesn't look to me like a total back to the future. And again, this isn't a really sharp disagreement with Andrew. This is a narrow disagreement, which is, I would just say the new normal is considerably more intensified ties between China and Pakistan than what we had before Cpec, and that will persist almost no matter what. I mean, unless you see a complete political reversal in Pakistan, which is unexpected. What he's also observed, though, is the narrowing of the focus of Chinese efforts to court and principally work with and through the Pakistani army. Now, I chuckle when I hear this because it sounds a lot like what the United States has been accused of over decades, which is that, we claim to work with Pakistan civilian governments, but when we actually want to get something done, we always go to the army. And so now we're seeing, we're conceiving that China is doing something similar. And here's a point that I think Andrew is right to make. For efficiency reasons, and when you're looking to see who can get stuff done quickly, the Pakistani army is at the top of your list. But for long-term sustainability and for political harmony within Pakistan, what you want is a national consensus that continues to favor these policies. That's the gold standard. We never achieved that. From a US perspective, we never achieved that in terms of the US-Pakistan relationship. And that was a vulnerability in that relationship, continues to be a vulnerability in that relationship. If Pakistan and China find themselves in a similar place, I think that will continue to be a vulnerability in the relationship. So that's an open question as to whether China and Pakistan will find an ability to more skillfully manage that political side of the equation. I don't see it yet, but I think that Pakistan's politics have also changed, and we can get into that if you want. But where this takes me finally to the trajectory of the relationship is that I think you'll have a new normal on the economic and investment side, and I think that the sky was always the limit in terms of the military to military and strategic side of the relationship. And here that continues to be the case. And from an American policy perspective, that's where I think we ought to continue to be focusing in terms of our concern about China's expansion of its regional influence. It is on the security side and on the strategic side. And if I were to sort of look at Pakistan's position, I would say here too, coming back to this balancing game, Pakistan's military leaders need to consider what increasing reliance on and embeddedness with Chinese military and security and intelligence community will mean over the long term, and need to make a decision on that. It's not a single decision, it's a series of decisions. But right now that trajectory looks to be a tightening of that relationship, not unlike the way that India's military and political leadership seem to be, by and large, making a similar decision about tightening of their strategic ties to the United States. Now, India has still got a kind of a balancing game with respect to Russian equipment, and Pakistan has a bit of a balancing game with respect to F-16s. So, so there's an interesting analogy to be drawn here, and I think that that's where our focus ought to be. How will India and Pakistan play that balance going forward? How they perceive interests, because those are decisions, or Pakistani decisions. They're not just Chinese decisions. It's not just China telling Pakistan what to do. It's Pakistan making up its own mind. And from American and former policy perspective, I know Pakistan makes up its own mind. So China needs to know that as well.
All right, perfect. This is a good segue to my last question to you, which is on, I want to know your perspective about the Sino-Indo standoff that's currently ongoing. What do you think are China's likely objectives, and how do you see its growing power base and confidence and the way it's asserting itself? How do you see that affecting the crisis with respect to its trajectory with India? Where do you see that heading? And coupled with this, I would want to throw in the question of, the traditional role of US crisis management in the region. How do you, look at, is there any space for US to jump in the Sino-Indo crisis? And pull these two countries apart like it's traditionally been doing with India and Pakistan? So this will be my last question. So you can, you also talk about Beijing's role in your book as well in the region. So probably you can, give us some sense of that from that perspective too.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is the other troubling story that's on everyone's mind who focuses on South Asia here. So the first aspect of this is kind of the unpacking of motivations by China and India. And I am still impressed by just the very basic drivers are a reasonable way to explain a lot of the complexity. So there are people doing outstanding work trying to look at the ins and outs about who did what and when and how and why, and trying to peel that apart in a very granular way. And that gets to the operational elements of their conflict and even the tactical elements of this, the conditions on the ground, the maps, who gains what from the heights and from the valleys, and all of the above, and who's done what and exactly when this is unfolded. But several years ago, and I don't know quite how long ago, but I wrote a piece that was contemplating the potential for Sino-Indian conflict and looking at their ability to manage that conflict. And even then it was apparent. I wrote that the single most likely source of their conflict was over their contested territorial land boundaries, and that potential for conflict, militarized conflict, was only growing as both sides were increasing their capacity to place more men and weapons closer to the border. And to see that border better in terms of their own ability to use modern means for reconnaissance, surveillance, and so on, and to firm up their claims along that border. All of that was simply bringing two big countries with increasingly capable militaries closer and closer together and more likely to come into conflict. So there's a kind of a grand unfolding, a long-term story that is just finally coming to fruition here that I think explains most of what we need to know, frankly, about what that trajectory is and has been. Now, so that's a story of kind of both sides naturally seeking some strategic, even other more narrower advantages along their shared borders. And in the past, what has tended to happen was that border conflict was more or less, I used the word earlier, stovepiped or managed separately from the rest of the bilateral relationship. And one of the things that's so fascinating and troubling about what's happened of late is that over the past several years, as these conflicts have gotten worse, they have not been able to manage it. Not only have they not been able to keep it from getting violent and bloody, but they also haven't kept it out of national politics, certainly on the Indian side. And so now what you're seeing is a politico-military conflict emerging from what had been a kind of a more narrowly constrained border view. And that political military shift brings it more into the category of like what India and Pakistan face, right? This isn't just a matter of who's killing whom, or who's shelling whom, or exactly where forces are stationed along the border, but how do political leaders act, how do they take that into policies going forward? And that is harder to manage. That puts certainly puts India, being a more democratic state, into a bit of a more challenging. It's effectively boxed itself in because it's harder to back down from a political military conflict, harder to find concessions, harder to manage things out of the public eye when they're watching so closely. So that's something that makes us even more worried that this is going to spiral into worse and worse conflicts, which are going to be harder and harder to manage. Now, a few years ago when I wrote that piece, I said India and China are very capable of managing a single conflict between them because they have some conflicts are really, by and large, that bad that they wouldn't manage to keep them bottled up, or at least within a certain bounds, not going to war with one another, because that they could manage this. Now we have the prospect of a multiple crisis scenario emerging. We have a lingering border dispute that has actually gotten violent of late, where both forces presumably are bringing more and more men and platforms up to the border, which create escalatory potential. Simultaneous to that, we have other sources of potential crisis. So whether COVID it doesn't look like a crisis generator, but it's certainly a tension generator. And you have things like the potential, let's say, death of the Dalai Lama, which would in itself raise tensions in terms of how does India respond to that? How does China respond to that? You have maritime disputes as well. And you have the continuing India-Pakistan dispute, which has the greater potential to see Chinese involvement one way or another.
Also,
my concern writing a few years ago, sorry.
So the GB province, if it makes it to the province. Yeah.
Absolutely. So now you have multiple potential overlapping crises simultaneous, which will be much harder, particularly in a more politicized environment, for the two sides to manage without ending up in an actual shooting war. So that is worrisome. Okay. Last piece of this, can the United States play a crisis management role? And the short answer is not really, because particularly right now, we have one clear dog in the fight. Obviously, we want India and China to avoid a war, but if anything, we are backing India and are ourselves very sharply critical of China. And that doesn't place us in a position of so much crisis management or de-escalation as it does in terms of assisting India to put up a stiff front against China. Or even feed that crisis. And you know, for right now, the answer is I think we are quietly working to assist India, certainly in ways that would give India a better window into what China is doing. And we're likely to continue to do that. That doesn't make us a, you know, an outside broker for peace in the way that at times we've tried to play in other regional conflicts. That makes us a party to the conflict. You know, the positive side would be if China sees that messing with India is going to bring it a huge amount of pain, then it will seek alternatives to that trouble. The downside is if India feels that it can push the envelope with China because it has outside backing, then that creates an opportunity for India to take risks that it wouldn't otherwise take. So that's the game that we're in right now, and it's worrisome.
Fascinating conversation, Dan. I think there's a lot of food for thought that we have with us. And with respect to South Asia, I don't think it's going to be out of news anytime soon. Ali, in his review, used your previous title, No Exit from Pakistan with respect to Beijing. I hope it does not turn out to be a tortured relationship, and the second part of your book title does not make it there. But thank you so much for being with us, for your time, and for this amazing discussion. And I think we should continue talking to each other. The situation is really dynamic, keeps on changing. So many players, so many objectives to be met, and it's a complex game. So until we meet again, you take care of yourself, and you have a very good day ahead of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you to Ali as well. I've enjoyed our conversation. I look forward to the next time.
All right. Take care. Bye.
Bye.